Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in. My name is Isaac. Before we get started, I just want to point your attention to the Jersey City Free Public Library's main website. You can access more events like tonight on our calendars of events section, where you can find out about more read out loud sessions, more author talks, and all sorts of entertainment. You can also access more entertainment and author talks through our YouTube channel by subscribing. Today, we have an author talk with Kiernan Ryan in his recent book, Shakespeare Universality. Here's Fine Revolution. Kiernan Ryan is a professor of English language and literature of Royal Holloway University of London, UK, and an emeritus fellow of Murray Evers College, University of Cambridge, UK. Thank you for joining us and welcome.
It's my pleasure, Isaac.
So, like I was talking to you before, can you give us a little, before we get into the book, can you talk a little bit about Shakespeare? I think he has a really interesting background. Most of us, I was telling you earlier, are introduced to Shakespeare in junior high school and high school through plays, but we know little about who he is and how he became the man he is.
Okay. Well, Shakespeare was the greatest dramatist of his age, of the Elizabethan age in England. He was born in 1564 in Stratford-upon-Avon in Warwickshire, in the Midlands of England. And he was the son of a glovemaker, and he only went as far as secondary school. Unlike a lot of the other dramatists of his day, who went to university, which really meant Oxford or Cambridge, he only went to secondary school. However, the secondary grammar school, as they called it then, that he went to, really would be the equivalent today of being a university student, because the range of subjects they taught, including Latin and Greek, was really quite rich and extraordinary. So it'd be wrong to think of him as somebody who, although his dad was a glovemaker, a craftsman, a tradesman, nevertheless, he had a very good quality education. That said, he was looked down upon by the university wits, as they were called. That is, the dramatists who went to university. In fact, one of them, a guy called Robert Greene, famously described him as the upstart crow, beautified with our feathers. In other words, he aroused great jealousy and envy amongst them because he was so successful and because he could master the English language more. He had a greater mastery of the English language on stage than even they could muster. And it drove some of them crazy that he shouldn't be able to do that because he didn't go to university. And as a result of that, down to this day, it's an extraordinary thing when you think about it. Down to this day, there are people, serious scholars, university scholars, who continue to argue that Shakespeare could not have written his own plays because he didn't have the education at a high enough level to do them. Can you imagine? And so there are theories and whole books have been written to say it was this aristocrat or that aristocrat. It was Bacon the philosopher, because they simply can't comprehend the fact that somebody who was a simple jobbing actor, but well-educated at a secondary school level, could develop those skills or could have those native abilities, developed just out of the power of acting and then starting to write scripts himself. And so he, as I say, was born in 1564. He died in 1616, not very old, but he was in his own time, his peers, a lot of his peers, the better amongst his peers, like Ben Jonson, famous dramatist and friend of his, recognized already then that there was something absolutely extraordinary about him. And in the collected plays of Shakespeare, collected some years after his death by his fellow actors, Ben Jonson wrote a poem which said called him the sweet swan of Avon, and said that his work was not of an age, not just of its time, but for all time, not of an age, but for all time, and that he was the soul of the age. So he was appreciated at his time. And I should say, by the way, it was quite extraordinary for a playwright to have his works collected at all in that day and published. Absolutely extraordinary. And if any of the people listening here to this talk ever find somewhere they stumble upon a copy of the 1623 first folio of Shakespeare's work, because there's only a few dozen left, they will be multimillionaires, I can assure you. They're worth pure gold, absolutely. No, he wrote comedies, history plays, tragedies, they were mainly, and certain other kinds of genre that perhaps fall in between those different genres. But those are the three kinds he wrote. And what's extraordinary about, one of the many extraordinary things about him was that he could move from a history play about an earlier period of English history, the kings and monarchs of the 14th or 15th century. And then in the next play, he would write about Midsummer Night's Dream, and fairies in a magical realm, in a story that he just invented from nothing. And then he'd go from that to a tragedy, and this flexibility of his imagination is absolutely extraordinary. And of course, people have lauded him for this. The bardolatry, the worship of the bard has gone on for centuries because there's nobody quite like him. The range, the complexity, the ability to empathize with such a wide range of people, regardless of their gender, their race, their class. This is somebody who can imagine at the height of Hamlet, one of his greatest plays, can stage a scene right on the cliff edge of the catastrophe in which Hamlet, a royal Danish prince, on the cliff edge of his, as I say, of his downfall, engages in conversation with a grave digger, digging the grave for Hamlet's lover Ophelia, right there on the stage, a laboring man. And this laboring man gets all the best lines and outwits Hamlet himself. Only Shakespeare, at such a moment, in such a play, would bring on an anonymous working man to speak as an equal and even outwit a royal prince. Classic Shakespeare. Same thing happens at the middle of Macbeth. Just at the height of the murder, when Macbeth's murdered the king, the next person who walks on, just as Macbeth is standing there, absolutely appalled at what he's done and the blood on his hands that'll never be washed clean, he brings a drunken porter on who does a little kind of shtick, a routine, comic routine, which parodies Macbeth's predicament from a lower class plebeian point of view, cutting the heroic tragic protagonist down to size. You see, there's this powerful leveling democratic element to Shakespeare's imagination. And that's one of the things I want to talk about when we get onto my book, that's allowed his drama to speak beyond his rigidly hierarchical society and culture and speak with more power to our culture than it ever could have to his own audiences. Yeah.
What about Shakespeare as a young man? He started his family at 18. He experienced his death happening at very
young. That's right. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that, those years of young manhood?
The missing years that exactly. The scholars have tried to make up, wondered what he did. There are several years where we just don't know what he was doing. But it would have basically what happened was he had what we'd call nowadays a shotgun marriage, because he got an older woman, Anne Hathaway, pregnant when he was 18 and she was in her early 20s, and so he had to marry her. And then all we can infer is that he must have gone, and at some point several years later we find him already listed as an actor playing on the Elizabethan stage. This would be in the 1580s, 1590s, yeah? And in between, some people have surmised that maybe what he did was he went and worked as an actor in a great house, and the house of a great aristocrat, part of their troupe, and gradually made his way to London. But anyway, the next thing we know about him after that gap is he's working as an actor, and that story I just told you at the beginning, he's being decried as an upstart crow after he's just written his first few extraordinary plays, the Henry VI plays. And he's already made his mark in an extraordinary way when he's already very young, as not just an actor, but a playwright. I mean, this is quite extraordinary, Yeah. And as you say, he, as far as we know, he spent the rest of his writing career based mainly in London, away from his wife and his children, his twins, boy and girl, Hamlet and Judith, and his daughter Susanna, 3 kids. And his son, I think, as you mentioned already when we were chatting before, Isaac, his young son died young. And his son, of course, was called Hamnet, which is interesting because it's so close to the name of one of his great tragic protagonists, Hamlet. Although he took that name, he actually borrowed that name from a close friend in Stratford called Hamnet Sadler. Exactly. So it was a well-known, I mean, an available name, you know, in his community. So then he spent most of his time based in London, but we do also know that he went backwards and forwards. He would have gone on horseback 2 or 3 times a year, maybe, to deal with affairs back home in Stratford. But it's true that he really did. He was estranged in effect from his home life. You know, he kept a strong base there, and eventually, when he became very wealthy because he was a shareholder in the Globe Theatre, he was able to buy the best house in Stratford for his family. So he never let go of the place, and he looked after the place, you know, financially. But his main life was based in the theatre world, yeah, and its surrounding community in London. Yeah.
So can you talk about the process of writing your book? Let's get into that.
Yeah, well, what started for me, Isaac, was really I wanted to find a better explanation for the Shakespeare phenomenon, for the fact that for the ever-expanding appeal of his plays over 4 centuries, during which they've fired the imaginations of theatre directors, filmmakers, playwrights, poets, novelists, composers, choreographers, and painters all over the world, while the works of even his greatest fellow dramatists, like Ben Jonson, whom I've already mentioned, or Christopher Marlowe wrote Dr. Faustus, they just remain, let's be honest, museum pieces that are of lasting interest only to scholars. And what I wanted to argue instead in this book, that what makes the plays of Shakespeare truly remarkable, what's enabled them to transcend their time and be more powerful and compelling in our day than they could ever have been even in his own time, is it's the way they dramatize, it's their ability to dramatize the way things were in Shakespeare's time from an imaginative standpoint that's still ahead of our time now. And by that I mean a standpoint that's grounded in his drama's commitment to what human beings have in common, as opposed to what divides them. So, and that means really that what that entails is throwing into question and rethinking the whole idea, the familiar idea of Shakespeare's universality. And I think there's a real problem with it. On the other hand, I don't want to let go of it. I want to redefine what his universality consists in. The conventional idea is that you know, the reason why Shakespeare has outlived his age, the age in which he wrote them, and is still incredibly compelling and fascinating across the globe, is that is the supposed idea, the idea that he, what his plays reflect is the timeless truths of the universal human condition, which is the same throughout all the ages, regardless of, and has an equal appeal to everybody across the world, regardless of their nationality, their race, their gender, their sexual orientation, their creed, their language. And if you stop and think about that for a moment, it's nonsense. How could they possibly appeal equally to people of such diverse ethnicities and sexualities and so forth, and nationalities and so forth? Absolutely absurd. In fact, it's literally untrue that Shakespeare's appeal is universal, because if you think about it, the huge part of the world that's Islamic, the Islamic culture finds drama itself taboo in its strictest form as a creed. Yeah, of course it cherishes lyric poetry and has produced and still produces some of the most beautiful lyric poetry that's ever been written. But it's not interested not only in Shakespeare, but any drama of any kind. Huge areas of Africa, no interest whatsoever in Shakespeare. I'm not saying they're at fault for that. It's just that culturally, it's never resonated with them yet, or perhaps never will, for all I care. And why should it? Huge areas of Asia. So, you know, there isn't a literally global appeal of Shakespeare at all. And then you might come back and answer and ask, you might come back and say, people have said, okay, but in the cultures like the Western ones, like in the States or in Europe, where Shakespeare is incredibly valued and staged and cherished and admired, and taught in the secondary schools, as you said. Maybe what's universal is our capacity, the capacity of everybody, whatever their gender, race, etc., to identify with the story of Prospero or Hamlet or King Lear or Othello, yeah? Regardless of their gender or class or orientation, etc. And again, that doesn't make sense. Either of you think about it. Can you imagine getting an African-American gay stockbroker and a Ukrainian immigrant cleaning lady and a Jesuit missionary from Paraguay in front of a staged version of Hamlet? And the idea that they would all at the end of it say, my God, that's my life to a T. He's really captured the essence of my life. I can totally identify with that. Absolute nonsense. So there's something, and also even more important than that, there's something politically reactionary and dangerous, I think, pernicious about the idea that what Shakespeare represents is the eternal unchanging nature of human beings. The human condition that never changes deep down, you know, despite historical changes and social transformations. Deep down, we're all the same, you know, whatever the differences between us. The danger of that is you can see that it's ideologically reactionary or can be used in ideologically reactionary ways, because what it implies is, well, there's nothing you can do about the way things are. Yeah, that's just how it is. Yeah, hierarchy, different. Some people are oppressed, some people get to the top. That's, yeah. So just all you can do is resign yourself to it and be realistic, as they say. Yeah, don't kick against it. So I think there's something ideologically suspicious and open to question about the whole idea of Shakespeare's universality in that conservative version of the idea. Whereas what I want to argue is, as I've suggested already, is that what's universal about Shakespeare's drama isn't the stories and the characters, the fates of Hamlet and Prospero and Henry IV and so on. What's universal is the perspective from which their fates are dramatized. Yeah? In other words, the standpoint from which they're evaluated and dramatized by Shakespeare, and the universal standpoint, therefore, from which we as the audience or reader are invited to perceive what happens to them in their hierarchical, divided, racist, misogynistic, patriarchal world. Yeah. So, I mean, just let me try and spell it out as clearly as possible. So, if there's anything universal about Shakespeare's drama, I think it's not the plights of his characters, not what happens to them, not the story of the characters, but the egalitarian perspective, the common human standpoint, as I said, from which they're dramatized by Shakespeare. So let me just be absolutely clear what I mean by that. The fictional worlds of Shakespeare's plays are just as class divided and misogynistic, racist and heterosexually biased as the Renaissance reality Shakespeare transmutes into poetic drama. How could they be otherwise? But those worlds are dramatized, they're structured and worded in ways that reveal not just the need and the right, but the potential of all human beings to be treated as equals for the simple reason that we belong to the same species. Shall I carry on, or did you want to come in there?
Like give evidence in terms of what plays that we can see that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I thought the best example I could give would be a famous speech by the Jew Shylock in The Merchant of Venice, which some of your listeners might well know. I'm sure many of them will know it, but even some school kids might well have come across it as well, because it's so extraordinary. And maybe I can try and show just on that one speech how Shakespeare manages to dramatize the way things were in his day. I mean, the systemic racism and inhumanity of his society, which tragically we're still all too familiar with, as if I needed to say that these days. And but he does so in a way that brings to light the ideal moral alternative principles from which to judge the inhumanity, to indict the inhumanity of that systemic racism. And establishes, in other words, the principles, the premises upon which a genuinely humane, civilized society might be founded. And you get the two things together in Shakespeare. That's the superb thing. You get the bad reality and the ideal emerging out of the protest against it. So you get the two things together, how things were and how things should and could be, because of the manifest human capacity to recognize that and see those ideal possibilities emerging out of the cruel, barbaric, unjust reality. So let me just get that speech. I should be able to do it by heart, but I'll just keep a copy here in case it slips my mind. So what I'm saying is, let me just make this clear what I'm trying to do here. It's because that potential equality, human equality, is never a kind of vague abstraction in Shakespeare, but always forged in the heat of compelling dramatic conflict and living dialogue by embodied characters, when they're performed on stage by flesh and blood men and women. The prospect of its becoming a reality, the prospect of that more desirable ideal, that potential equality becoming a reality in the world, it acquires a credibility, it becomes realistic in a way it couldn't be if it were merely an abstract contention in a political argument or a philosophical discourse. So as I said, let's take a look at Shylock's famous searing retort to the Jew-baiting Christians in The Merchant of Venice. "Hath not a Jew eyes," says Shylock, "hath not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions, fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons, subject to the same diseases, healed by the same means, warmed and cooled by the same winter and summer as a Christian is? If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die? And if you wrong us, shall we not revenge? If we are like you in the rest, we will resemble you in that. The villainy you teach me, I will execute, and it shall go hard, but I will better the instruction." And boy, does he do that. Now, Shylock, in that speech, is rebuking his tormentors on the grounds that they share the same physiology, faculties, emotions, and needs, which make them equally vulnerable, equally mortal, and equally justified, therefore, in avenging the wrongs done to them. His riposte to their racial bigotry invokes a concept of equality that indicts, in effect, every form of inhuman discrimination. Of course, the irony is that Shylock is determined to vindicate the compassionate principles to which he appeals by violating them through revenge. But the physically founded concept of equality Shylock invokes transcends, goes beyond the vindictive purpose for which he's enlisting it. It propels the vision of the play, as distinct from the viewpoint of the character, way beyond the Elizabethan age 400 years ago in which it was written, and making it as much a play for today as a play for 1596. And if I could just go on maybe to expand this point, if we take the passionate defense of wives driven to adultery by their husband's ill treatment that Shakespeare gives to Desdemona's maid Emilia. You'll remember this, having acted in the play yourself, as you told me, Isaac. Just before Othello enters to murder Desdemona for her alleged adultery, she says, Emilia says, "But I do think it is their husbands' faults if wives do fall, if their wives do commit adultery. Say that they, their husbands, slack their duties and pour our treasures into foreign laps, or else break out in peevish jealousies, throwing restraint upon us, or say they strike us, as Othello just has struck Desdemona, or scant our former having in despite. Why, we have galls, and though we have some grace, yet have we some revenge. Let husbands know their wives have sense, that is, senses, like them. They see and smell and have their palates both for sweet and sour, as husbands have. What is it that they do when they change us for others, for other women? Is it sport, fun? I think it is. And doth affection breed it? Affection means something stronger, like lust in Shakespearean English in this context. I think it doth. Is it frailty, weakness, that thus irks? It is so too. And have not we affections, desires for sport and frailty as men have? Then let them use us well, else let them know the ills we do, their ills instruct us so. Well, I'm sure you've noticed that the direct echo of Shylock's speech is unmistakable. Emilia bases her protest at the, in this case, sexual injustice to which women are subjected by marriage in a patriarchal society on the same irrefutable evidence of physical and emotional affinity that Shylock adduces to upbraid his abusers. Emilia's argument is the cynical response, of course, of a worldly wise wife of her rank, conversing informally with her mistress, woman to woman, about the woes of married life in that period. But once again, while the immediate purpose of the character and the cultural context of the speech remain anchored in their historical moment, the enlightened rationale of the speech gives us, the audience, the reader, a view of the matter, in this case, the unjust plight or predicament of too many women then and now, that points far beyond that moment. So in both speeches, Shylock's and Emilia's, how things should and could be is brought to light by a protest against the injustice of the way things are. The capacity of human beings to base their treatment of each other on what unites them is discovered and voiced in response to an intolerable reality. I hope those two examples helped a little bit to see how you get the way things are and the way they could be meshed together in the same speech.
Can you talk about chapter 1, Reclaiming Shakespeare's Universality? Can you talk about what's going on in that chapter?
Oh, in that chapter, well, that's I was trying to trace, it begins with me showing that I was trying to reach back into early great Shakespeare critics, particularly Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who I'm sure many people will know as the author, as a great poet, of course, of the Romantic period, the author of Kubla Khan and The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, but also, without question, one of the two great early Shakespeare critics. Really, still probably, in my view, I don't think there's many critics have equaled him, let alone matched him to this day, because in him, you can already see that idea of Shakespeare's universality in a more interesting, provocative sense emerging. He famously says, I was really struck when I was rereading him, and I found him saying that while Shakespeare, this is a quote, while Shakespeare registers what is past, in other words, the way things were in his time, while he registers what is past, he projects the future in a wonderful degree. Now, he doesn't explore that and examine it and spell it out why that's true, but it gave me a kind of clue to follow, you know. And the other guy who was writing about the same time as him, William Hazlitt, great romantic essayist, prose writer, wonderful, wonderful guy, and a radical at that time. We're talking now the early 1800s, about 1811, 1812, 1818, about that time. And Hazlitt also recognized this prophetic quality in Shakespeare. He said, for instance, Hamlet is a prophetic play that is above that of history. In other words, its perspective goes beyond the history of its time. It escapes the moment in which it was written. But then what Hazlitt did that Coleridge didn't do, and I talk about in that first chapter, Hazlitt recognized as well that the other thing Shakespeare had that went together with this, this compulsion to peer forward into the future, into what might be, this prophetic impulse, that what he had at the same time was a powerfully democratic imagination. He said in a wonderful passage, he says that he treated the servant and the beggar and the king exactly the same. And of course, in a play like King Lear, at the very climax of that play, there is the most extraordinary scene, one of the great scenes, not just in Shakespeare, but in world literature, where a king who's been forced to learn what the poor naked wretches of his own kingdom feel, an arrogant, absolutist aristocrat, is forced out into the cold to experience hunger, cold, and despair, to feel what it's like to have nothing and be nobody, yeah, and to be treated with contempt. He forces him to meet a real beggar, naked, a poor naked wretch. And he looks at it and he says, in the most extraordinary scene, he says, thou art the thing itself. A poor bare man is nothing but a poor bare forked animal. Now, what's so extraordinary about that is that that scene enacts, this is something Hazlitt grasped, that scene enacts the understanding that class society has no basis in biology, in nature. Those class divisions between beggar and king, king at the top of the hierarchy, beggar at the very bottom, they're artificial creations of human culture. So they're open to question, they're open to be changed. And he has a monarch forced to realize that beneath his royal robes, his ermine-clad robes, as you see on stage, and beneath a mad beggar's rags, beats the heart of the same poor, bare-forked animal. Yeah, that's what it comes down to. There's that egalitarian, that democratic edge. And so with these little hints and feeling that I was finding some support from those great critics of the past, I tried to develop and extend that argument, and find some more powerful support in certain more recent theoretical critics, like some of the Marxist German critics like Marcuse, Herbert Marcuse, absolutely important, and a guy called Robert Weimann, who again weren't afraid to rather unfashionably at the time insist that there was something still universal about Shakespeare's drama, but that was universal in a quite different sense from that old-fashioned reactionary, ideological sense. Yeah. So that's mainly what I was doing in that opening chapter, was setting out the terms of the argument and trying to find some footholds for what I was saying, some precedent for what I was saying back in previous critics. Yeah.
I'll talk a little bit about chapter 2.
Okay.
Can you explain some of the points that you're raising in chapter 2, prophecies?
Yeah, the prophecy, well, as you can imagine from what I've said already, it's to do with Shakespeare finding prefigurings, foreshadowings of the future in the present. Mm-hmm. And there's a marvelous speech. I think I can probably remember it if I got it here in the book. I should say perhaps first, Shakespeare's poetry, the sonnets, and as I show in that chapter 2, and the plays are absolutely riddled with prophetic moments, with moments where in the poetry, for instance, in the sonnets, he's continually saying, imagine that day when we are dead, or when you are dead. Yeah, and looking back upon the way things are now from beyond the grave, absolutely extraordinary, and explicitly talking about being the prophetic soul of the wide world, dreaming on things to come. Extraordinary lines from one of the sonnets. And there's one bit I love particularly. Here's a sonnet. This is sonnet 81. Begins, your monument shall be my gentle verse, which eyes not yet created shall o'erread, and tongues to be your being shall rehearse, when all the breathers of this world are dead. Now that's extraordinary. The eyes of human beings who haven't even been created yet will one day read this poem that I'm writing to you now. And tongues that don't exist yet will speak these lines. And I've just done it, what he said. I've just done it. I've become one of those people, those tongues to be, those eyes not yet created. Yeah? When all the breathers of this world are dead. Notice again the democratic thing, the egalitarian thing. It's not when all the lovers of this world or all the grand lords of this world. It's everybody and every creature that breathes. And that ability to, you get that, this futuristic, if you like, this future-reaching standpoint, actually sometimes takes a literally posthumous point of view. Do you know what I mean? Like it leaps forward beyond the grave for the liberty of the grave in a way, to look back untrammeled by the way things are, You know, you can really, yeah, does that make any sense? And there's another one, this is a very famous one. Everybody knows or has heard of the scene where the assassination of Julius Caesar. And of course, just as they stab, all the flipping conspirators stab Julius Caesar to death, of course. And as they finish, as Cassius, one of the main conspirators, leans over the lacerated corpse of Caesar, he says famously, it's extraordinary, really. How many ages hence shall this our lofty scene be acted over in states unborn and accents yet unknown? Whoa, does that take some chutzpah from Shakespeare? He knew that one day, listen to this though, in states unborn, societies and states that don't exist yet, there's no name for them, and accents yet unknown, and languages we've never heard of. And he's right, that's what happened. That is what happened. So that prophetic impulse in him is incredibly powerful. And he has, and the way it links up to reading his plays, perhaps can be encapsulated in Henry IV, Part 2. A character called Warwick is given this speech about tracing the course of the future in the contours of the past. He says, there is a history in all men's lives, figuring the natures of the times deceased, the which observed a man may prophesy with a near aim of the main chance of things not yet come to life, who in their seeds and weak beginnings lie entreasured. Such things become the hatch and brood of time. But in a way, Shakespeare's inviting us to do with his plays and poems what Warwick's recommending. If we look in these works of the past, these Shakespeare's dispatches from his distant past 400 years ago, we can find the main chance of things as yet not come to life, who are just germinating, just evolving within the inhuman, unkind reality in which Shakespeare found himself. And you know something, Isaac, I think you only begin to understand this extraordinary upstart crow, as he was derogatorily called by those rival playwrights. You only start to understand him, I think, if you think of him, how alien he felt within his world and time. Coleridge, somewhere else, says of one of Shakespeare's poems, he writes exactly as if he were of another planet. My argument in the book is that that other planet is the alternative, truly human, civilized future that men and women in our time are still struggling to create. Nietzsche, you know, the great German philosopher, said, I love this bit, he says, we children of the future, how could we be at home in this today? I think Shakespeare would have understood that, because he was a child of the future who could never be at home in his today. But what he could do is give us this extraordinary gift of being able to look back on his past that created our present, as if we were already citizens of centuries to come in a more civilized world. Yeah.
Why do you think he's able to do that so well?
Oh my goodness me, what a question. Yeah. He does it. I don't think he does. Let me put it this way. I think it's important to say that I don't think he arrives when he sits down to write as if I would know. But my hunch is that when he sits down to write, he hasn't got some, you know, libertarian, egalitarian philosophy, you know, that he then translates into characters and stories and so on. I think he'd be a bad writer if he did that. I think he starts to write his play, like, for instance, let's take the example of Shylock, whose speech I quoted. And of course, he's got it set up in a rather conventional way, because that's where the story that he borrowed the story, that's how it's set up. You've got Shylock as the evil, demonized Jewish villain, yeah, who the Christians triumph over by the end. So he's not going to do anything implausible and unrealistic, like have Shylock win, you know, because he wants to be truthful to the reality of what would happen to somebody like Shylock if he tried to take just revenge against those who had demonized him and treated him like dirt, as subhuman. So it gives you that reality. But notice, but as he starts to work the conflict and develop the dialogue between them, his empathetic imagination, that's a phrase I often find myself reaching for, his capacity to empathize imaginatively, even with the villain, as it were. And I think he has, as a glove maker's lad from the sticks, I think he always identified with the underdog and the outsider. I think that's part of it. And what he does, as he starts to imagine what Shylock would say back, he then starts to develop a speech which magically, wonderfully starts to establish the reason why that anti-Semitic abuse is unjust, because the same blood flows through Shylock's veins, Jewish veins, as through their Christian white veins, exactly. I mean, just to put it simply, but it's so powerful. And I think it's because there's a very good book which I quote, a novel which I quote in my book by Robert Winder, called The Final Act of Mr. Shakespeare. And he has a wonderful little scene where he has one of Shakespeare's actors talking to the famous poet John Donne's daughter, who asks the actor, what is this thing about Shakespeare? Why is everybody crazy about him? Why is he so wonderful? And he says, well, you know, I think what it comes down to is this, says the actor. He says, Shakespeare knows that, you know, that when kings die, you know, worms will eat them just the same as they will anybody of any class below them. You know, the old idea of beggar and king being equal in the grave in the ultimate democracy of death. And he says, and the point is that it's not that that's an original idea to Shakespeare. I mean, that's a familiar idea, isn't it? Death, the great leveler. Yeah, that cancels all those distinctions that prevail in the world of history and society. But what makes Shakespeare different, the actor says, is that Shakespeare never forgets that. It's not just the odd speech or insight that he refers to. It organizes his entire vision all the time. It's structured into the way he organizes the architecture of the plays. Yeah, the impulse that I mentioned before, when he's got Hamlet on the verge of his great catastrophe, that he would bring a nameless laborer into conversation with him just at that point, to articulate the egalitarian principle as dialogue, not as an abstract idea, but as a living fact before your eyes. Even Hamlet can't help saying, my God, this guy's got the better of me. He's a wise fool who knows that this is a member of the ruling class going to his death. And he's just biding his time till history's time is his time. And you feel that at that moment. Absolutely extraordinary. And just an incredibly good question you're asking me there, because what is it that, do you know what I think the other thing, big thing is? I think, if you push me to it, I think it's something to do as well with him being an actor. And you know, we all know the famous line, all the world's a stage and all the men and women merely players, and one man in his time plays many parts. It's what the academics call the theatrum mundi topos, the world as a stage, the theater of the world. Now that's an arthritic cliche, you know, and it's usually trotted out as another sign of the, you know, the vanity of human existence. One day we'll all fade away. It's just like, we're just like ephemeral beings on a stage, and one day our actor will be, which is true, you know, I'm not knocking it. But with what Shakespeare does that makes him different when he uses that idea, he sees the subversive political implications of that. Because if all the world's a stage and all the men and women merely players, then different scenarios, different storylines and plot lines can be mounted on the stage of history. And the person playing the king now will be playing the beggar next week. In fact, both those characters might well be playing parts yet to be imagined in our time. Completely different roles and identities that don't exist yet. There's no reason why, and actors know that, don't they? But Shakespeare made that into a principle of dramatic creation and vision. Do you know, that the sense that, you know, the way an actor, I mean, a really great actor, and you've done some acting yourself, so you know more about this than I do. but that sense that in a curious way, when you played Othello, you were simultaneously you were inhabiting that part and saying those lines as yours, as Othello, as becoming Othello in that moment, in that agonizing predicament. And yet all that while, at some level, you were aware of being an entirely different person. Isn't that right? It's never completely gone. And I think Shakespeare saw that as a metaphor for all our lives in the real world outside the stage. All that human potential to be otherwise, to be somebody else, to live differently, think differently, feel differently than the way you happen to find yourself living and thinking and being at that moment as that person with that name, yeah, that color skin, that creed, that language, that mentality. And it's that's the secret, I think. I think that's the secret that he saw, and he makes it apparent throughout his plays, this sense of the endless human, untapped human potential, just electrically charging every scene. So that even as everybody you see playing these roles, male, female, black, white, king, beggar, could at any moment have the capacity to be anybody else. Their tragedy, or in the comedies, their farce, their absurd farce is that they have, God help them, they have to be that person in that predicament, in that story. That's what I mean. That's the tragedy of Hamlet's the perfect example of that. Hamlet is charged by the ghost of his dead father to avenge him, because to kill his uncle who murdered Hamlet's father, and Hamlet just wants nothing to do with that entire world. The whole setup stinks to him. Yeah, the time is out of joint. It's not just about revenge. I don't want to live in this world as this person with this obligation. I don't want to be complicit, tainted by the whole damn thing. And yet I find myself having to be. So he beats himself up about his inability to act promptly and just be a conventional, revenging Elizabethan prince, doing all the right stuff that he should do. Yeah. And yet he can't get out of it either. Yeah. That's the tragedy. He could be, he says, there's a wonderful line where he says, I could count myself a king of infinite space if I did not have bad dreams.
We're coming towards the end of this segment.
Sure.
What are some of the biggest takeaways you want readers to take?
Oh, yeah, right.
Well,
I think, I suppose if I had to, perhaps the best thing would be to follow on from what I was saying about the Shakespeare realizing the subversive and visionary, emancipatory implications of the idea that all the world's a stage and all the men and women merely players. Because I think what Shakespeare's plays do, if I had to sum it up maybe as a takeaway, they achieved what Bertolt Brecht, great 20th century German political dramatist, what he defined as the aim of all genuinely revolutionary art. That is, the Shakespeare's plays use every resource of language and theatre at their command in order to depict contemporary reality in such a way as to make it clear that it's not the only reality possible, that the way things have been until now is not the way they have to be, that other forms of life are imaginable and desirable, and that men and women have had in the past and still have now the power to make those more desirable forms of life a reality. That would be my takeaway.
Thank you for coming on. I know that you have a new project that you're working on.
I do, yes. Well, it's finished, thank God, Isaac. Yeah.
And so you're going to be, I don't know if you can release that title to us, but you're going to be coming back to speak with us about this new book that's coming out about Shakespeare.
I'd be delighted to, Isaac. It's called Shakespearean Tragedy, and it's coming out in August. And if you'd like me to talk to you about it, I can't think of anything I'd rather do.
Where can listeners find more of your work if they're interested in reading more about the book that's covered today and other work that you have?
Yeah, well, actually, there's a really good, if you go to, if they just go online to the British Library, Big Deal British Library, they commissioned me a few years ago to write 4 short articles, so they're nice and short and readable, just a couple of thousand words each, on all the 4 big tragedies. And so really the essence of that book, those ideas about those tragedies in my book coming out in August, which much longer there, but the essence of those ideas is all kind of nicely encapsulated there in the British Library's website. And also that's, in other words, an essay, an article about Hamlet, about Lear, about Macbeth, and about Othello. Mm-hmm. And also one about Shakespearean tragedy overall as well. And what's really good about them is not so much, whatever you think of mine is one thing, but because it's the British Library, what they've stitched into them are wonderful links to all the materials they have in the library about, oh, for God's sake, you're a librarian, what am I talking about? They've got all their resources are linked up to pictures from productions from all over the world, items to do with the theatrical history and so on. So that every point, you've got all this extra juicy stuff. They were deliberately designed for the general reader, and more especially for secondary school kids and their teachers. So if you go to British Library, Discovering Literature, and that'll give you the link, and then just look Kiernan Ryan, and then all those tragedy links will come up.
Thank you.
Not at all. Thank you.